This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The archives.
Episode 146. Does outsourcing create a problem for local economies?
Welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, outsourcing. Lots of companies do it because it's cheaper to get stuff done overseas where labour is cheaper. But isn't that damaging to the economy? Doesn't it take jobs away and create unemployment? Well, you might think so, but unemployment is pretty low everywhere right now. So does that mean we just create other stuff and it ultimately leads to more productivity? Or is it something we need to do something about, like President Trump is trying to do with tariffs and protectionism? That's this time on the Debunking Economics Podcast. So, Steve, most Western companies outsource their manufacturing overseas, often to China. So you've got companies like Apple and Nike. Walmart, apparently, works with 10,000 different manufacturing plants in various parts of China. And why wouldn't they, of course? Because it's cheaper. So there's no downsides for the company in doing that. There's just downside for the economy.
Yeah, this is something which I had actually analysed way back before I became an academic, back in, I think it was, 1987 or something like that nature, 84, looking at the whole issue of the relocation of production. Because the fundamental outsourcing, there's two types of outsourcing. There's a company that says, we're a car company. Why do we have a computing wing? Let's outsource our computing functions to IBM and we'll just do the car manufacturing.
Yeah.
That's one side. The outsourcing you're talking about right now is relocating production, saying we're
cheaper labour. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we're retailers. We're selling stuff to the public. We don't have to make it ourselves. We can make it overseas and bring it in more cheaply. And that was the secret of China's industrialization from with the Gang of 4 days, with 89, 90, 91. You had the Gang of 4 kicked out after Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping back in power. The cat philosophy, it doesn't matter what color a cat is, black or white, as long as it catches mice. Let's industrialize as fast as possible. And then going for export-oriented industrialization at the time when the Chinese workforce, I have no idea what the actual pay rates were, but it's something of the order of what was a pay rate for a American worker for a day would be a pay rate for a Chinese worker for a month. And there was such a huge cost advantage to American companies relocating their production to China and then exporting it back for sale in America. But masses and masses of did it, even though the Chinese required them. And this is a unique Chinese policy. No other developing country has done this. It required them to have a Chinese partner, regardless of the amount of capital they started. Within 5 years, the Chinese partner had to own half the business. Now, that to me gives you an idea of just how attractive the wage differential was for American corporations to agree to that anyway.
Interesting now, Chinese companies, because they do, have a developing domestic economy as well, and that domestic economy is demanding quality goods, and they're willing to pay for it, but the companies making it for the domestic economy obviously want it to be as cheap as possible, so they're looking to countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh and Botswana and Ethiopia and the Philippines. So as China's domestic economy grows, they are starting to outsource themselves as well, and so it goes on.
Yeah, but there's a bit of a limit that the Chinese Communist Party won't let go as far as the American the political scene has, and that is you don't want the Chinese to revolt. Because, I was in China in 81, 82, one of the very informative experiences in my life, when I took a bunch of journalists there for a conference with Chinese journalists. But as part of it, we happened to be in China during the finals of the women's volleyball competition. And the final was won by China against Japan. And there was an edict from the Communist Party saying, do not demonstrate in Tiananmen Square. Well, the journalists that I was with knew that they'd ignore that. And we went down there and saw roughly, I think, about a million people on bicycles celebrating and letting off crackers and so on in Tiananmen Square. Now, that's the positive side of a demo. The negative side, where there were so many strikes and demonstrations and revolts during the financial crisis because Chinese exports fell by something like 40%. And the impact of this was, first of all, factories would downsize as they do anywhere else in the world. But in China, when you lost your job, you were normally unable to get Social Security instead because you're registered. This is a bit of a hangover in the communist days. You're registered in your place of birth it's very hard to change it, which would be some province in the west of the country. So something in the order of 50 million Chinese found themselves hopping on trains to go back to the countryside they'd left 10 or 20 years earlier. They weren't happy, and the demonstrations went through the roof, and that's a major reason why the Chinese stimulus was so big. Now, extrapolating a bit forward, if there's a scale of relocation of production that means you start getting unemployed Chinese workers, then I expect demonstrations to come along that the Communist Party will respond to. Whereas in America, they couldn't give a rat's ass about what the working class thinks. And that's why you ultimately get them with the working class voting for Trump, because the policy of relocation of production goes on regardless of the opinions of American workers.
And because there are so many Chinese workers, there's this idea of low-cost labor is going to carry on forever, isn't it? So even if you have hotspots within China, I think this is starting to happen as well. Some places are getting more expensive, so they are moving production facilities inland to other places where the labor is cheaper. And so, and you can do that, goodness knows, hundreds of times over, because there's so many places in China, such a big population. We're never going to run short of low-cost labor in that part of the world.
No, I think they've certainly done a huge amount of absorbing it. I mean, they really are. Australia is the manufacturing hub for the planet these days, outside of countries like Germany that hung onto their own manufacturing as well. And then Japan. But they have played a massive role, and it is having an impact. There are, wages have risen in general, not just for manufacturing workers. I've been to China a few times. I've been to quite a few towns in China. And when you look at the standard of living that people are enjoying there, it doesn't feel too different to a middle-class American town. In fact, it feels a lot better frequently because you don't see as many homeless.
Unless they get shot.
Well, yeah. I mean, there are political sects and religions you shouldn't belong to in China for your own health. Yes, so I do take that point. But the level of prosperity is quite high. I think it's understated by. If you look at the comparison in terms of renminbi or yuan to the American dollar, it looks like the Chinese aren't anywhere near as well off. I think certainly the average Chinese in the third tier and above towns is doing pretty well, except those working in some of the sweatshops. So complicated answer, but I think it's not as possible to do that relocation within China anymore, and that's why a lot of Chinese companies are outsourcing. Right. I'm seeing Bangladesh turning up on plenty of the clothing labels I see these days, and equally Vietnam.
So what about the impact then on Western countries that are outsourcing so heavily? I mean, for example, what does it mean for innovation? If we simply use cheap human labor, it's a bit of a one-way process then, isn't it? Because we won't, for example, get new ideas coming from the workforce if they work in sweatshops and they don't speak our lingo. We're just going to keep on doing what we've done before, trying to lower costs as much as possible when it's not moving things forward too much.
Well, this is actually an interesting point, because if you look at what led to the Industrial Revolution occurring in Scotland rather than anywhere else in the world, and it was specifically Scotland rather than the whole of the UK, it looks like a major factor was the high level of wages compared to France. Now, the difference, because France was the other major power at the time of the Industrial Revolution, and if you look at the scale of wages in textile manufacturing in France versus wages in textile manufacturing in Scotland, there was a substantial difference, and not quite as big as America versus China, but it was something like wages were 2 or 3 times higher in Scotland than they were in France. Right. When you do, I've forgotten the academic who did
so
this.
more incentive to replace that expensive labour with machinery then. Yeah.
Exactly, and that's what happened. And the spinning jenny meant you went from, I think the original spinning jenny, which is, it's a flywheel that lets you attach 6 spinning wheels, which was powered by one worker rather than one worker per spinning wheel. The cost of designing it, the cost of with sale level, was not profitable if you were French, because you were displacing cheap labour. But it was profitable if you're displacing Scottish labour. So part of the reason why innovation occurs is actually wages being high. Right. And that's one of the reasons you can use an argument against the proposition that you often see that we should,
But is that, well, yeah, but I mean, in this day and age, with transport being much more readily available, in those days, they probably wouldn't have invented it. They would have just gone, well, okay, let's get the French to do it because they're cheaper.
Yeah, if they could actually do the transportation. Now we can do the transportation. So in that sense, it probably has been a reason that there's been less innovation because you're using cheap labor. But cheap labor is expensive in various ways as well. This is one thing which a lot of factories have found out to their cost. And just a little anecdote here, I bumped into a guy in my travels who works in RFID chips. That's a manufacturer of chips which are used for on store tabs and warehousing and so on, to indicate where particular items are. And he said the machine they make, I think, needs 9 workers to produce 14 million RFID chips per year. In China, they've got 15 workers producing 6 million. He said he has no idea what the extra workers do and no idea what the productivity is lower. But in fact, you don't get the same productivity out of unskilled labor in one country versus in another. So there are costs involved. And a lot of firms have found this as well. They've got a longer supply chain than they'd like to have. Now, of course, Trump's coming in and disrupting the supply chain by whacking tariffs left, right, and center. Yeah. So
will that work? Do you think? Has Donald Trump got a point that China is behaving unfairly, and it's because it is keeping those production costs lower, and is he going the right way about it? Are tariffs the answer?
Well, I think conflict might be part of the answer, but what he's got wrong, of course, is that one of the reasons why he's uncompetitive is the bloody American dollar being the reserve currency. If they're willing to surrender that, which of course they're not willing to do, then the price differential between American and Chinese goods would potentially halve because the American dollar is that massively overvalued by its reserve currency status. So he's not. That's what I'd do.
Right, but it's not just the US. I mean, everyone is outsourcing to China. I mean, we don't make clothes in Britain anymore, do we? They're all made in China or Taiwan.
Yeah. And this is the whole globalization thing. The fact that transporting is cheap. Transport plus low-cost labor is much cheaper than doing it domestically. But again, it gives you a very lengthy supply chain. Things can go wrong. So even though
that's the price you pay, you're still up at the end of it all, aren't you?
Yeah. But then in terms of what you do for future industrialization, now that with the developments in what I call low-level AI. So not AI that actually can solve a mathematical problem for you, but AI that can run a machine rather than having a human controlling the machine. That sort of AI plus 3D printing, or additive, as they call additive manufacturing, as it's called. All these sorts of things are meaning you don't even need the labor in the first place anymore. So why not locate the machine domestically rather than internationally?
So that is bad news for countries like China and all these other developing nations that are relying basically on low labor costs because there's not going to be the demand for them. So what's going to happen to them?
I think that the days of the strategy are numbered in that sense, and we're starting to see that it's mainly hitting industries which are like the low-hanging fruit of 3D printing, and one of those is clearly construction, because 3D constructing device can quite feasibly build an entire building 10, 20 times faster than you can do with human labor. So as that technology is perfected, but it will ultimately go through to a whole range of other areas as well. And like, for example, if you're looking at building the chassis of machines and bodies of vehicles, the need for assembly can be, large parts of it can be reduced, not dispensed with completely, but substantially reduced. And then you've got a shorter production line. You've got more control over the design than you had, more control over flaws in manufacturing. So I think that the days of this massive advantage of relocating production to a third world country and exporting back, I think they're numbered.
Well, we've had car assembly plants, sort of automated for a long time, and yet we still have a lot of people sitting in derelict offices in China putting iPhones together manually. Yeah, and that's surprised that's still happening.
Yeah, and it's amazing what is advantageous to industrialize versus what isn't. I know a piece I wrote on this issue on the whole role of energy in production. One little example I used was from a New York Times article about a production facility in America making air conditioning units, and one of the jobs of one of the workers there was to insert like what looked like a pair of tweezers, which is basically a thermostat unit, into the machines 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 times a day. Now, it wasn't worth because it's such a specialized task, it wasn't worth the company's while to design a machine to take her place, simply inserting this thing in a particular hole in each of the air conditioning units. So that sort of thing can apply with low wages. With higher wages, well, you better make that machine. And you then develop once you get fossil energy or solar energy involved in something, it doesn't have the limitation that human energy has. It won't get tired. You can do it much faster as you develop, and that's what happened with the spinning jenny as well, of course.
But that human being still exists, of course, so that human being is still using up the same amount of energy, whether or not they've got a job or not.
And that becomes a dilemma. We've got an income distribution issue coming out of this because over the next 30 years, depending on how human society survives the next 30 years, but over the next 30 years, I think we'll see enough development in technology that the role of humanity in actually producing any physical output will fall virtually to zero. And in terms of what's feasible, not necessarily what actually happens in terms of investment, but you are not going to need human labor. The production line will be a thing of the past in terms of workers on the production line. What you'll have is workers whose job it is to maintain the production line, but the production line being entirely automated.
Right now, where we are seeing a lot of outsourcing, what's that having on domestic wages, on the country that's doing the outsourcing? I'd assume it would be part of why we're seeing wages being kept low, because, you'd be worried about going to your boss and asking him for an increase if you've got this fear that if you ask for a job increase, your job's going to disappear overseas. And I'm wondering whether that's what we're seeing now, and that's why inflation is so low and taking so long to pick up.
Yeah, I think that's a major factor. And like when I did this analysis back in the early 1980s, I think it was, I used Joan Robinson's framework what he called the golden age capitalist economy, making up a picture of two economies that are both growing at very stable rates over time. And then you have one country, which is a country like Australia, which is a importer of everything. Exports raw materials, but imports its manufacturing. Another being a production base like America, producing everything. And then having China come along as a low wage area. What happens when you relocate production from the America to China? What happens, of course, is the wages go down in America, the wages rise in China, but by nowhere near as much. You get an increase in profit in China, an increase in profit in America as well, because you're now paying far less wages costs for your production. But what you've done is reduced aggregate demand, because you're selling those goods back into a population where there are now less workers because you've sacked some of them, and they're now living on social security rather than wages. Then your aggregate demand will fall. And the same thing. So you do get this does have an impact on aggregate demand, and yet look at the number of people who are now working in the United States, supposedly at an all-time high. Yep, and that's partly because, again, the government spending stimulus coming in plus QE. But I'd see QE as having had far more of a role over time, just the sheer scale of it, because every year $1 trillion worth of central bank created money going into the financial sector, possibly about 100 to 200 billion of that washing out into the real economy. That's a fairly substantial stimulus over time. And when they try to withdraw it, the stock market crashes, and they start going the opposite direction on QE once more. And we're consuming more than we would before. So stuff is cheaper because it's outsourced overseas, and companies are making a healthy profit but still selling less. And so we're able to buy more. So our consumption goes up, which is not necessarily good for the planet. Yeah. So, we are in one hell of a mess right now, but certainly I think outsourcing has been a major factor, first of all, in the development of a country like China, and then also in deindustrialization in America and the swing to the right in America, because being abandoned by the Democrats who went for, in identity politics instead of worrying about the working class, because the working class are being screwed by people who'd vote Republican, the Koch brothers and so on. The workers themselves start voting Republican because they think they're being ignored by the Democrats. So we've produced a hell of a mess now in the job when the wage and the cost advantages have declined so much because of the increase in wages in China and because of additive manufacturing. The work might well move back onshore again, but the jobs will not. Well, will they? I mean, if China becomes too expensive, as I said before, there's those places that China is looking at for cheaper labor. So you've got Bangladesh, Botswana, Ethiopia, the Philippines. There's no shortage of places where you can turn to for low-cost labor. Yeah, I know that certainly we're seeing that China is doing that as well. So, but I think the overall thrust of manufacturing over the next 30 years is going to be reducing the role of labour so substantially that those cost advantages are going to be outweighed by the the unreliability of the supply chain that comes out of it, the length of the supply chain. So companies that decide to relocate and produce domestically with additive manufacturing plus AI-controlled machinery, they're likely to get an advantage. Certainly, they're going to be able to move faster than their rivals who rely upon the outsourcing.
So here's a question that's been asked, I think, many times. In fact, I remember my dad asking this question about 30 years ago when he was moaning about the fact that Britain doesn't make anything anymore. And, you know, if we are outsourcing everything, if most production jobs are going overseas, other than, as you say, through QE, how is an economy creating money? It's getting it from services like, you know, from education and finance and health, which is sort of all there to service a population, but there's nothing physically being created. Does that actually matter?
I think it does, because this comes down to what does economy actually do? And this is my energy perspective here, gives me a different orientation. And that is that what we're doing fundamentally is converting energy into useful work. Now, the percentage of the population that's needed to do that has been plunging over time. So most of us are involved in what David Graeber quite rightly calls bullshit jobs. Yeah. And often those bullshit jobs reflect the hierarchy that we're part of, because the more people doing bullshit work for you, the higher your status. And there's another brilliant academic I know through Blair Fix, I was one of the examiners on his PhD thesis. He said the only thing that explains income and wage distribution, not just in capitalist societies, but going right back through time as well, is hierarchy. The bigger the hierarchy you sit on top of, the more you get paid. So a lot of these jobs are being created not because it's sufficient to have flunkies doing useless work for you, because flunkies doing useless work for you make you look important and justify your huge salary. So it is a mess and a half, but it works so long as we're still generating a net surplus. Not a net. I mean, that's a term I'm rather leery about using right now. But so long as we're getting more energy out of the global system than we're putting in to retrieve that energy and turning it into goods and services. Now, our danger is we're approaching a crunch point on that front. We can't continue doing that. Yeah.
You know, I wrote a book 10 years ago, which I wouldn't recommend anyone read. It's called The Incumbent, which was all about how the government was basically putting all these unemployed people into a very large telco where they thought nobody would notice. And it was all going fine until someone got in charge of the telco and actually tried to make it efficient. And, you know, everyone was going, no, don't do that. And they decided the only way to solve the problem was to kill him. But, you know, it's, a story of our times. I still wouldn't recommend reading it. So, look, just how sustainable is all of this, then, I wonder? And what can a government do about it all? Because, I mean, if they tell companies that they need to push their costs up by employing local people, and the companies are going to say, well, this is going to make us internationally competitive, we're not going to do that. We want to carry on doing what we're doing. Okay, maybe artificial intelligence and the ability to and automation is going to, mean that some of these jobs can be replaced, but that doesn't give people jobs, does it? It just means you getting rid of the outsourcing. You're just recruiting machines locally. The problem is not going to go away, is it, until every country in the world has a parity on wages? And obviously that is not going to ever happen.
No, I mean, that's one of the parts of neoclassical theory. They thought that parity would apply, but the differentials are still there because, hey, the real world has additional cost you like to ignore in your model. But yeah, I think to me, the ultimate direction we're going in is one in which workers are no longer necessary for production. And therefore, the way in which workers can currently blackmail, and that's what it really is, blackmail the owners of machines to get a salary that means they can live comfortably, is saying, unless you pay me, I won't press the button to turn that machine on. Now, when a machine can press the button to turn the machine on, that particular bargaining power goes out the window.
Right, but who presses the button on the machine that turns that button on?
You get a tiny, tiny, tiny number who
You've got one person who presses the button that turns all the country's machines on.
Yeah, fundamentally. I know in terms of, for example...
Two buttons. One to start the machines, one to start nuclear war. Just make sure your job is to make sure you press the right button.
The right one. But I know, I won't mention the company, but one of my colleagues worked in a firm where the management was trained in the use of the machinery. And in the case of a strike that occurred, they could instantly take over, not quite instantly, but fairly rapidly take over the machinery. The clerical workers became manufacturing workers, and no fall in production occurred, which just completely stymied the power of the workers to go on strike and demand wage rises. Now, that's going back 20 years. If you fast forward 20 years from now, then the bargaining power is completely gone. So if you're relying upon employment as the basis of the political power of the mass of the people to get a decent share of the energy we're converting into useful work on the planet, then it's going to fail. So I think, to me, that's why ultimately I'm a fan. I know there are people complaining about universal basic income being a way of reducing incomes and anti-working class, et cetera, I think inevitably it's the only way that we're going to get a decent standard of living for the majority of people who don't own the machinery, is to have a universal basic income and then enable innovation to still occur for those who want to get themselves a large profit.
So short term, though, because that's sort of hopefully it's a mid-term answer, but short term, right now, where we've got lots of companies outsourcing and people without jobs as a result of that, what can we do short term? Do we need to do anything short term? And then sort of like another form of outsourcing is actually where you bring that cheap labor from overseas into your country and bring it onshore, particularly for semi-skilled jobs like the H-1B visa program in America, and of course the 457 visas that keeps the mining industry going in Australia. Should we allow that sort of thing to happen, or should we say no, hell no? For these jobs, we've got to find local workers.
Yeah, and I think I would ultimately go for that basis, saying you want to get the benefit of work in your country, going to workers in your country, and the same for profits, the same for investment. I'm very much a critic of letting capital relocate and letting labour relocate to get cheap wages to work in a developed in a wealthy economy. It's unhealthy for everybody. You look at what actually happens to the conditions that workers get in that area. A lot of very dreadful stuff occurs. So I would like to have those limitations. Funnily enough, they're part of neoclassical theory as well, because if you look at the way in which neoclassical explain where gains of trade come from in their mythical model of comparative advantage, one of the essential assumptions there is neither labour and capital are completely mobile within countries and completely immobile between countries. If they're allowed to be mobile between countries, they can no longer conclude that a rise in profits in one country benefits the residents of that country.
Yeah, it destroys the whole competitive theory of advantage, doesn't it?
It does, and that's why they assume it doesn't happen. But of course, it does happen. So what that then again means is, increasing wages profits in China aren't necessarily good for Chinese capitalists if it's in fact going to American capitalists. Of course, it applies much more to Australia, where a huge part of our capital stock's been sold off to overseas companies. An increase in the profit rate in Australia does not mean an increase in the welfare of Australians, because most of that profit goes overseas.
So what you're saying is the argument for free trade goes against the argument for freedom of movement of labour and capital.
Yeah. And that's not acknowledged by the neoclassicals, of course, but it's part of reality.
Love that point to finish on. Great to talk as always, Steve. We'll catch you again soon.
Okay.
And that's it for this time. We'll have another Debunking Economics podcast for you next week. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.